Welcome everyone to another in the series of the Planet Project's conversations. Each month, or whenever we feel like it, we find someone that's very interesting, someone at the cutting edge of social change and cultural evolution to talk with. And today, I'm so thrilled to have Jude Currivan with us. Jude is one of the most articulate and heartful voices in the world today for conscious evolution and the emerging paradigm of unitive reality. And we'll be exploring that more today. I think almost everyone on this call knows Jude. Probably she doesn't need any introduction, but I did put in the chat the link to our events page, which has a more full bio. It's got links to her organization, also to the wonderful film that she gifted the world last year, A Radical Guide to Reality. There's also there a link to a review summary that was just done of her book, The Story of Gaia, which is quite good. So I invite you to check out any of those things. And I am going to change our view here a bit. And I'd like to start out, Jude, by just asking you to share a little bit of your story, how you got where you are today, and were there any influences or significant moments?
That's like asking, let's do this in 2 minutes. It's like, my goodness me, I look at everyone in this room and I know and love you all. And I appreciate that everyone has been on this incredible scenic route to this point. Every one of us could share our stories, and I hope more and more of us do, because I think what's really important is when we share our stories, people go, that challenged me, and that was difficult, and all the rest of it. I started, as some of you know, the daughter and granddaughter of coal miners in the north of England. And when I was born back in 1952, coal mining was still, the sort of the community industry. There was very little for anyone else to do. And it was a very challenging and difficult work, of course, to the extent that my dad died at the age of 32 from coal mining related disease. But the thing that it was an incredible community. It was a community of love. It was a community where everyone cared for everyone else. There was never anyone that went lonely. There was never anyone who went hungry. There was never anyone who didn't have what they needed. And it wasn't what they might want, but everyone got what they needed. And my mum was like the community shaman. We didn't even know that word then, but she was the wise woman. She was the wise woman. And when everyone had difficulties, whether it was spiritual, emotional, physical, mental, they found their way to our door and mum's door, and she never turned anyone away. And she was my soul model. I talk about soul models, but she was my soul model. When I was 4 years old, I started to hear voices and have out-of-body experiences and began to walk between worlds. So here I was, in this incredible, grounded, very practical community and environment on the one hand, and on the other hand, I was walking between worlds. And I feel that that's been my dance ever since. And it's been a very, very scenic dance, and I'm very grateful for every step of the way. It took me into Oxford University with a master's in physics and cosmology and quantum physics. It took me into business and organizations, and I became one of the most senior businesswomen in England and ran operations in 36 countries with $500 million turnover businesses, learning to speak and communicate in a way that could be heard, that actually the real meaning of communication, not just saying something, but unless it was heard and understood and reciprocated, it meant nothing. So there was that route. I did a PhD in archaeology, researching ancient cosmology. And now, of course, I do what I do, whatever that may be. But my work and my life really has been one of co-weaving leading edge science, universal wisdom teachings, indigenous teachings, the nature of consciousness, what it means in our world. What does it mean if the world that I've understood and experienced since 4 years old, which is a whole world, which is a world where its unity is differentiated but not separated, what does that mean in a world where we've journeyed for the last 100 or more years along a journey of, perceived separation? So everything has led me, I think, to this point, as all our journeys do, where I can now share from that journey, but I can also serve, I hope, the remembering of who we really are and the wholeness of which we're a part, and what that can mean in the world when we make choices seen through the lens of wholeness, as Bob would say, rather than through the lens of separation.
Jude, I'm curious if when you were 4 years old and started to hear voices, if that created problems for you. Was your mother or your parents aware of that? And how do people handle when they're particularly gifted and the world doesn't really validate that or honor that? Did you have any of those experiences?
Yes and no. Well, first of all, I never shared it with anyone until I was
Good idea.
way older. And so, but I didn't do that out of fear, Roger. I sort of, it didn't occur to me. I know that sounds crazy or silly, but it never occurred to me. I was having a lot of fun, for starters. Um, but it didn't occur to me. I absolutely know the depths of myself, that if I'd have shared it with my mum, she'd have honoured that, she'd have trusted that, she'd have embraced that difference. Because, even without knowing that, I was still a cuckoo in the nest, because my first lecture on quantum physics was given at 9 years old when she invited the neighbours round.
How did that how did that look? I mean,
Well, basically, she'd get offered them tea and biscuits, and anybody will show up for a good tea and biscuit. Certainly in our community. So there, as I talking about quantum physics, which I had been seriously following since I was able to read at the age of 3 and 4 and 5. So it wasn't madness on my part, but she would have accepted it. But the point was, I didn't share it because it wasn't just mum that would have heard what I shared. It would have been potentially our neighbours, our friends, especially at school, our teachers, my teachers. So it just never occurred to me. But it was such a natural part of my experience, and it has been ever since, that it's basically who I am. And what I'm realizing and have realized is that this is who we all are. The understanding we now have of unitive reality is that it's multidimensional, and that our natural attributes are able to experience in what's called non-local ways. So, people like Dean Radin and others and myself are describing this as supernormal experiences and supernormal phenomena. They're not paranormal, they're not supernatural, but they are perceived as such if you have a worldview of separation of materiality. And so I feel really grateful, and I feel really protected that it didn't occur to me to share these experiences till much later. And I didn't even then, but people used to come up to me at dinner parties and at parties in the corner of rooms, even in boardrooms, out of the blue, and say, Jude, I've never shared this with anyone else. And they'd look around and they'd say, I've never shared this with anyone else, and they'd tell me their stories. And then I'd share, mine, and I'd say, look, you're not alone. So there was, even though whatever the impact, and they used to do that with mum. Mum used to be on the receiving end of so many stories, and people would say to mum, and trust her. And so I feel honoured that people trusted me with their stories. And I hopefully reciprocated that by sharing mine and saying, you're not alone. And you're
yeah,
not crazy.
beautiful. So what attracted you to business and what attracted you away from it? What was that about? It doesn't seem to quite fit with the rest of the scenario.
Well, probably the same things, actually. First of all, we lost Dad when, as I say, he was 32, I was 10. And then I had a disastrous love affair when I was 19 at Oxford. And two things. First of all, I decided I was going to shut my heart down because it was just too painful. And secondly, I had a year where it was incredibly difficult for me to study. And although at the time at Oxford, I'd been taken under the mentorship of a wonderful man called Dennis Sharma, who was Stephen Hawking's mentor. And Dennis saw something in me, and he invited me to write an essay for the physics community. There was an essay prize, and I did, and I wrote it on black holes, which was really pioneering at that time. And I won the prize. And so, thanks to Dennis, I got £25, which kept me in beer money for a whole term. The point was that he, like he did with Stephen and others, he saw something, and he told me something that was really important, even when I was, feeling it really hard to study because of all this emotional turmoil. He said, Jude, he said, don't worry. He said, you don't need to go into academic life. He said, what you do need to do is stay curious. And what you do need to do is to continue to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And so what that meant is that I was supposed to go on and do a PhD there and then, in galactic evolution, as you do. And I couldn't, I didn't. And so I went into business, plan B, because I could add up. And so I qualified as an accountant, and eventually I became one of the most senior business women in the UK. On things like the Stock Exchange Listing Committee, and as a non-executive director of another business, and two $500 million businesses as the chief finance operator. But the point was that Dennis's guidance stayed with me from that moment all my life. So even though I was in academia, and I'm delighted I wasn't in academia, because I can't imagine being able to have this conversation in the way we are if I'd have followed that path. But I still kept studying, I still kept following the evidence, deeply into experiential research on consciousness, deeply in respect of ancient understanding and indigenous teachings and traditions, deeply interested in what the leading edge of science was getting to, even though at that point it still showed no symptoms of getting beyond its materialist, reductionist, separatist perspective. But I stayed with it. And I'm so glad I did, because I'm now able to share what leading edge science is saying, which of course is converging with universal wisdom teachings. But if I hadn't done that, and I suspect if I'd have gone into academia, then I would not be able to serve in the way I'm serving. So what got me into business was almost like plan B from that. But there was also an excitement to it. I enjoyed it. It wasn't a burden. And I traveled the world, more than 80 countries, which enabled me to, at weekends and holidays, I was able to visit sacred places, places of ancient wisdom, beautiful places. So do that. And I left it because I couldn't bear one more strategic plan. I couldn't. That was going to sort of impose all of this nonsense on the world, that the minute you wrote it was out of date, essentially.
Do you see a connection between that strategic plan and standard business practices and the material paradigm of science, kind of the old paradigm?
Very much so. I mean, obviously I say obviously, but I am, I've sort of watched this journey with archaeology and anthropological archaeology as my PhD, but fascinated by our journey over the last sort of 10,000 years. I'm fascinated by the universe's journey over nearly 14 billion years, and how we play our role within that. But realizing that by the mid-late 19th century, the mechanistic view of the universe was the scientific perspective. And it drove technologies that became the backbone and the driver of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution didn't just need the science, it also needed how you educate your children, what the healthcare was going to be, so you got the workers, so you could have a workforce to actually power the Industrial Revolution, because labor was still key to that. So and the organizational structures that enable trade that more complicated, and I'm going to say complicated, not complex, because it came from a paradigm of mechanization. It became a complicated system rather than a complex system, which is what Gaia is, what nature is, what the universe is. So it became hierarchical. whereas nature is not hierarchical, she's holarchical. It became so top down and domination. You know, our friend Rian Eisler talks about partnership versus domination, but all of that drove what's come. And so when I was still in the corporate life, I was seeing that at its, you know, at its height. And at its height when it was still to some degree just about manageable. But what's happened in the 30 years since I've moved on is that we have moved into an information age, we've moved into a digital age, we've moved into an age where those hierarchies cannot be sustained. But the deeper issue is all the extraction, exploitation, inequalities, inequities that they have driven can no longer be sustainable. So they bored us as far as they could bring us. And it seems to now that, for me, what's so exciting now is that all of this is coming into a convergent head where that is no longer sustainable. And yet what is being awakened is offering us a remembering and an emergent potential to move beyond that. So I'm not in the blame and shame game, because we could go deep into that. And I'm very much as a healer, cognitive of the, aware, and I've worked as a healer with psycho-spiritual issues and trauma issues for many decades, both on personal scales, on family scales, and collective scales, and planetary scales. But also, now that we can remember who we really are, now we can remember we're inseparable from each other. How does that help us to heal the trauma of that dis-ease of separation? And also, how does it invite and empower us to evolve into what we can become?
Yeah, you've really articulated very nicely the sort of the old paradigm. And of course, Rian really nails that with the domination paradigm.
It does.
And the new, of course, which all of us here on this call are involved in trying to birth the new paradigm. We have such interesting people on this call. I'd like to open it up to others, and I'm going to go back to gallery view here because I wasn't seeing any raised hands. But please chime in or ask questions of Jude. I think let's just pause a minute here and see if anyone would like to share anything. Yeah, Heidi.
Just two things I want to comment on. I love hearing your story, Jude, and I haven't heard the early story very often, but I really love it. And first I want to comment on that idea that you just naturally didn't share it, not out of fear. Just how amazing your mother must have, the subtle field that she gave you to live in, where you didn't even have to make a point of it or say anything. I think can't be overlooked is that full acceptance. She obviously knew something. But whether or not she said anything or you ever talked to her, I just have to say that was something that you were really blessed with and that you give others. That's what you give others. So just wanted to point that out. And the other thing is one of the reasons it's so much fun to work with you on transformational things is because you do have that full range of the most ethereal or essential and then how it looks in the world. And often people are kind of at one end of the spectrum or the other. But one of the things that I have so loved about working with you in the Deep and Rapid Transformation is that you have you include it all, and they aren't counter each other. They're an expression of each other, and that has been a joy to work with. Just want to say.
Thank you, Heidi. And thank you for that. It's been amazing to work with you. You know that. I mean, it's just such a joy for me to work with all the folks that we're working with on DRTC and beyond. And my mum also came from a long line of intuitives. I know that. I mean, my grandma was that. So she, as you say, she knew, but she also knew not to impose what she did was she loved me unconditionally. And my brother's very different, and we love each other unconditionally. So that's what she taught us. And I find all the way through my life, things she said, like I was on the call earlier and Suzanne was on the call. And I said, something she said is, if you see something wrong, then it's yours to sort out. That was one thing. She also said, do the right thing, whatever it costs. Don't count the cost of doing the right thing. And the only thing she hated, there's one thing she hated, and that was lies. She couldn't bear lies. And I remember once coming home late, and she was upset, not because she was angry with me, she was worried. And I gave her this BS excuse, and I've never seen her so angry. And I couldn't bear to lie ever since that. I couldn't bear to hurt her, and I couldn't bear to be, I could hear her in my head. If I ever told a lie, I couldn't bear it. So her wisdom and her love walks with me every day, is in my heart.
Great.
Tez.
Yes. So Jude, you know how much I love you. And it's so wonderful every time we get to hear your wisdom. So thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. I am wondering, and I know that this is the sort of question that you'd rather we all pondered and answered, but while we have you here, I'm wondering from your perspective, what kinds of opportunities might we pay attention to? Because everyone here is interested, of course, in expanding unitive consciousness. So what are the opportunities from your perspective that we might choose to pay attention to?
Thanks, Tez. And I love you too. You know that. For me, it's many years ago, I had a voice, the universe said to me, just say yes to invitations. You'll not need to push it all. Just say yes to invitations and be discerning, but just say yes, and especially show up and get out of the way. that was a corollary. Say yes and then show up and get out of the way. So that's been a guidance for me. And I think more and more these opportunities abound. I mean, we were recently together, some of us in Iceland, and we were there for something called the Spirit of Humanity Forum. It was ostensibly a 3-day conference. I mentioned it to a few of us, and we ended up having 12 evolutionary leaders and 16 folks from the Deep and Rapid Transformation, DRTC, with us. And I really had no expectations, but I just had a sense that something might emerge. And my goodness me, it did. Because when we do show up, say yes, and show up and get out the way and come together and link up and lift up, magic happens. That whole time leading up through, after, and ongoing has been full, not just of synchronicities, but the ways forward, how we can, come together with emergent opportunities and synergize our efforts. So I think rather than try and be ultra specific, it's just the principles of doing this, and how much we've come to love and trust each other, which again, that coherence is vital, because what it's doing is it's increasing the effectiveness of what we do many, many, many fold. I think those are the key things. And I love the unexpected. I love that some of the greatest joys and ways forward that come through, I have no idea. And then they appear. And so it was like the DRTC itself. We really didn't know 18 months ago when Joni came to us, actually, and said, look, the Secretary General's made this call for deep and rapid transformation, and we're already working together from a unitive perspective. And our sense generally as change makers is that's not going to happen unless we bring forward a unitive perspective to serve that. And that became 23 roundtables, that became the convergence in New York, that's become phase 3, that's become so much more. And we're still in the, I don't even think we're at base camp yet. Yeah. And I'm so joyous and grateful for us to be that. And that's true of all the opportunities to link up and lift up, because they're there and we just have to say yes. And one final thing, that's at the sort of the ground level, as it were. That's and beyond, but that's sort of doing it. But I, as well as a cosmologist, as some of you know, I'm also an astrologer. And this year's astrology is quite extraordinary. And on July the 7th, we've got Uranus moving into Gemini. And for those who aren't astrologers, that's a big deal, because Uranus is the archetype of innovation, and I would say innovation. Bringing this revolutionary potential into the sign of Gemini, which is an air sign, which is a sign of understanding, and Gemini being the twins, the divine and the human. There's something that I'm sensing is just ready with this worldview, this paradigm shift, to really go into that whole next level of potential. And the other astrological key, and there are many, but the other one is that we have Saturn and Neptune. So grounding our understanding of the nature of reality at a whole beginning of a whole next era, which is 0 degrees Aries. So I'll stop the nerdy astrology there, but just to say this is an absolutely pivotal moment with all the turbulence. I think it's incredibly exciting for its emergent potential. And so to say yes to that, I think is really important.
Beautiful. Bob. I think there we go.
Well, yeah, this is a great opportunity by itself to be able to hear your story as a whole, Jude. As you know, I've heard bits and pieces of it for quite a while now, and and it really is great to hear it as a whole, especially where you started with your early childhood. I want to go back to something that you mentioned at the end of Roger's last question, when you were talking about convergence. And I have a two-part question around convergence for you. So the first part is, how did your current sense of convergence come to you? Was it a natural arrival? Was it easy, or was it a difficult search? Or was there a particular moment when your current awareness of the conversions that you were describing became clearer to you? And the second part to that question is, with that sense of convergence that you have, and the way of being the cosmologist that you are, it may seem, it seems to me, I'm not sure if it does to others, that your way of being a cosmologist is also a way of being a futurist. And in that sense, I'm wondering if you can also think about how convergence relates to how your current understanding of convergence relates to our collective future.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited that your new book's just about to come out as well. So perhaps we can just talk about that as well, because that whole journey into wholeness is something you write about so beautifully. And so that's another key opportunity for us to come together and share that and help others to be on this journey that you lay out so beautifully. So thank you for that. Yeah, for me, it's curiosity is my middle name. My mum always used to say that why was my favourite word. And bless her, when she couldn't answer my whys, she taught me to read when I was 3. So she'd send me the way of books to try and find some more answers to the whys. But the convergence has been an ongoing journey, really. Some have been big steps, some have been small steps, but there are many, many, many steps of those. But they've interwoven my curiosity about, fundamentally the nature of reality itself, but through those tracks of leading edge science, and not just cosmology and physics, but evolutionary biology and systems, and across the piece and all scales, with universal wisdom teachings and indigenous teachings. Because when I was little and having all of these experiences, it wasn't quantum physics sort of gave me the clues, but really what gave me the sort of grounding and feeling of safety in this journey, apart from my guides, was the ancient writings, especially the Vedic tradition of ancient India, the Gita and especially the Upanishads, that was showing that this was the reality that the rishis saw, and that the mystics are all, traditions essentially, through ages of seen. So there was that convergence, and then there was the research into consciousness, not just human consciousness, because I've never felt that human consciousness is central. I've always come from a perspective of universal consciousness, of which we're microcosms. So I've never had that sort of human center and look out. It's always really been the out looking in that sense, and the dancing together. So that convergence. And then the business and the organization, and what does that mean? Because that's our grounding, and that's the way we live our human walk in the world in many ways. How do we live our lives here? But what was really interesting, one pivotal point was when I decided to leave business. And do you all know the tarot? Do you know the card, the Fool card? There's this fool holding this rose and just about to jump off a cliff. Well, I was the fool, because I left business. In the mid 1990s, I was earning $350,000, $400,000 a year, which in those days was pretty good, given before it came crazy. So I was earning a lot of money, and I knew I needed to move on. And I was getting this urge that something was coming, and something really important was coming. And my place to serve that best was not actually in business. It was somewhere beyond that, but I had no idea what that meant. So off the cliff I went. And I remember going from having a diary that was fully scheduled a year out with the business work I was doing to nothing. Literally everything fell away. And what I didn't understand was that pivot point of the convergence. And I remember one night going home, and I had no idea where I was going, what I was going to be doing. I jumped off the cliff, no idea where I was going. And it was dark night in the middle of the countryside. And I was still thinking from that old way of looking ahead. And I got an inner voice that guided me to come to a place near where I live, which is an ancient barrow. And it was the discarnate guardian of the barrow whose voice I was hearing. And he said, "Come to me." So I stopped, I took the car to the lay-by of the road, and I had no torch in the car, no flashlight. There was no moon, and it was very, very dark, and it was out in the countryside. But where I live, the rock, the grounding is chalk, so it's white. So just in starlight, there's just enough light to see by. And so I walked up the 1/4 from where I left the car all the way up to the barrow, and then went inside the barrow where it was absolutely pitch black, but I had no fear. And up to that time, I was so worried. I didn't know what I was doing. I was concerned about how to go forward. I wasn't sleeping well. And in those few minutes that I was in that place with that ancient guardian, something happened. And how I went into that barrow and came out of the barrow was like a rebirth. And I trusted from that moment on. And that was that really pivotal point of convergence. And I came out and I walked the way back to the car and I went home and I slept for the first time in months. I had no worries. I just trusted. And that really for me was the most important part of the convergence, because after that, with all the challenges, with all, not the easinesses of them, but the challenges of them, I still trusted that somehow the universe was guiding me, was inviting me, so that I could serve the good of the whole, so that I could serve whatever was coming in the best way that I could.
Did that answer your question?
Partly.
That was great, Jude. Thank you for that detail and that true highlight of your life. That answered the first part of my question perfectly.
And the second part, remind me again the second part.
Yeah, the second part was as a cosmologist, and with the
Futurist.
the understanding of convergence that you have, how does that help you envision the future?
Thank you. I wrote it down and then completely forgot it. So thank you for that. As a cosmologist, I look at the whole story of our universe, as you know, back from the very beginning, 14 billion years ago, nearly that. And in that, it's not the old paradigm of a universe bereft of meaning and purpose that began in what we're taught as being a big bang. And we know it wasn't big, but it wasn't a bang. We now have all the evidence that it began in the most exquisitely fine-tuned way, ordered way, but so ordered that it could meaningfully exist to purposefully evolve from simplicity to ever greater levels of complexity and individuated self-awareness. So I've sort of followed that and been in awe, absolutely been in awe of that journey of 14 billion years, to the extent that even before planetary systems were formed 5.5 billion years ago, we now know that interstellar clouds of dust, stardust, and ice had actually taken that level of emergent complexity to the level of prebiotic building blocks of biological organisms. So we found that by looking at the light emanated from those clouds. We knew that there were the forerunners of the bases of amino acids were there, of lipids, of sugars. The one thing we didn't know until this year was something that we found when we took when a robot was a satellite robot was sent to an asteroid called Bennu, and Bennu as an asteroid is 4.6 billion years old, so older than our planetary home. And a little scoop of material was gathered back from Bennu, brought back to Earth and analysed. And that tiny analysis, a teaspoon of material, showed that all 5 nucleobases, the building blocks of DNA and RNA, were in that soil, in that rock that was the asteroid. And those asteroids came from, as the whole planetary system did, from these interstellar molecular clouds. So the universe got us to that point even before our solar system was formed. I mean, that is pre-planning. That is purposeful planning, in my view. And then, of course, when our planetary system was born, Gaia came in as a Goldilocks planet, a water planet, a Goldilocks planet, able to nurture ongoing complexity. So I look at that, and ever since, and so I see our universe as a living, loving, unitive being that is innately sentient. And so that sentience is moving into ever greater levels of individuated self-awareness. And we're on the bow wave of that. We and our planetary home and our solar system and the whole universe are on the bow wave of that emergent, continuing evolutionary arc. So for me, looking at it's a choice. It's our universe is inviting us to remember who we are so that we can actually become co-evolutionary partners with not just Gaia, but our whole solar family going forward. So as a futurist, that is, our cosmic destiny. It's like Mission Impossible if we choose to accept it. But it's a mission, but it's not impossible. It's a wonderful invitation and opportunity, it seems to me, to wake up and remember and then consciously evolve. And that waking up and remembering is that we are inseparable. We are unique and yet inseparable from the whole. So that is, for me, that is what cosmology has, what I've understood as our universe is not a great thing, but a great thought, a great and finite thought of an infinite internal cosmos. And as Joni always says, unity is not an aspiration. It is our existential reality. So us waking up to that realization, and then what do we do about it? That is our future. I hope, a hopeful future, an authentically hopeful future.
Beautiful. So you talk about remembering who we are. How did we forget? What is it that happened? The indigenous people didn't forget, but what happened to the mainstream Western civilization? Which I agree with Rian. It's a 5,000-year project of the domination culture. How do you interpret that? And
yeah, I agree with Rian on this. And I'm not in the shame or blame game. For me, it's been part of the journey. It's been part of the journey to now. Because if we go back 10,000 years and earlier, our ancestors, it seemed to me, had this profound sense of community. When I look at the barrow that I went into and had that transformational experience, they're called long barrows. And when we archaeologically, we see that all representations of the whole community were buried there without grave goods. There was no hierarchy. There was, I've got a bigger sword than you've got, because there weren't swords in those days. This was Neolithic and prior. So, the children, the young people, the women, the men, the old people, there's representations of the whole community there in a very egalitarian way. And then, from my perspective, again, as in archaeological terms, around 5,000 years ago, it was an interesting point in Britain, actually, because up to that point, our monuments were this egalitarian sort. And prior to that, when I did my PhD, I studied sacred places that weren't monumentalized. There were things like springs and mountaintops, natural places of sanctity, everywhere sacred, but special places between worlds that were seen as being sacred, and they were open to everyone. And then the monuments came, but even the early monuments were again egalitarian and available and community based. But it seems that about 5,000 years ago, and we see this in England, there was an incoming wave of people from Central Europe, and they brought with them a very different culture. And they did bring with them a culture of domination and hierarchy and male, with the men sort of with, by then, Bronze Age and having weapons. And the monuments changed. They started to build round barrows where individual burials of folks who were seen as important were buried, almost all men, and all with grave goods around them. But when I first came to live where I live at Avebury, which is an ancient sacred site, again, because my mum would say I talk with anyone, so I spoke with the guardian of Avebury, the discarnate guardian of Avebury, and I remember she telling me about an invasion that came from the south. And her time was around 5,000 years ago, when the first beginnings of Avebury as a sacred landscape, some of it was being laid out. And I remember her saying to me very clearly, an invasion came from the south that changed everything. And at that time, none of this was known. And when I did my PhD, none of it was known. But I learned about something called the beaker culture. And the idea was that the beaker culture was just pottery, different pottery. And that was the view of it. It's only been in the last few years that it's been from DNA analysis of beaker wares and the skeletons are associated with it, that it's been realized that there was this huge immigration wave that literally, from a DNA perspective, took out the genetics. The male line of England was taken out by it in a couple of generations. So what the Guardian told me was absolutely correct. And so that domination took over. But what it did is it began the road to greater and greater levels of individuation. And yes, it took with it a domination and all of that means, but it also took us on this journey from we space and all space to the me space. And my sense is we could not have come to this point, good, bad, and indifferent, to wake up to remember our uniqueness, and from that uniqueness expand our awareness. Now at this next level of emergent potential, had we not gone through that journey. Because I think otherwise we'd have been taking a sort of an indigenous mindset straight away into this evolutionary potential. And I don't, speaking to my indigenous friends, they're coming to it and they've held the wisdom for all this time for us, but they've realized that younger brother, in a way, needed to take this journey so that now we can all come together again and go forward together with both the both and of that deep, profound wisdom and the sense of individuation that now we can dissolve gently and come together and include the me and the we and the all. So that's my sense of looking at it.
See, Suzanne.
Oh, Anne Baring has such beautiful work on all that. I'm sure you know, she's
I do. She's just done a beautiful new book that I think she mentions me in it, and she's sending me a copy of it. So our beloved Anne, she's amazing.
really. What I wanted to ask you was how you think all of this relates to the current situation, where overshoot could be the end of us. You know, I always remember the chapter in Universe of the Green Dragon called Evil from Cosmic Risk. And it was where the universe created when the universe created humans, it took a risk.
It did.
It did so because it could have something to appreciate itself. But the risk was that it created something that could destroy itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, as we go along with all of our wisdom and the horror that's going on, what about this overshoot that if we don't deal, even if we do deal with it, it's tremendously challenging to get past it, survive. I mean, civilizations have an average life of 250 years. 250 years. We're in the same, year 250. So how do we factor all of that in?
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said, because, of course, Gandhi once said, when asked about what he thought of Western civilization, he said he thought it'd be a good idea. He really didn't see us having a civilization in that sense. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that's why, unless we do wake up pretty quickly and at a level that can actually do something about this, we're running at 1.6 Earths for every year that we have. We can't. We're at that point where in my view, we've only got a very few years to really resolve this. And yet I'm also describing a meta crisis, or reframing, suggesting we reframe this meta crisis as a metamorphosis, and going through, this breaking down, this dissolution, but the imaginal cells of the emergent potential butterfly are forming. Not just us in this room, but the hundreds and thousands and millions of folks who are linking up and lifting up from a perspective. And they may not call it a unitive perspective. They may not have a cosmology that even goes there. But what they do care about is about community and looking after each other. And, from that view. So for me, it is acting local, feeling global, thinking cosmic at all of those levels. And all that we can do, going back to what I said earlier, my mum said, if you see something that you feel needs doing something about, then it's yours to do. And that, for me, is at the very heart of this. I can only do what I can do. I hope I do it to the best of my ability. I always ask myself, what is mine to do? Because it can't be everything. But my journey has meant that I can do something. And this is the something that I can do, and taking all of this very much into inviting people, welcoming people, empowering people to link up and lift up as much as we possibly can. And that's one of the reasons why the DRTC, the Deep and Rapid Transformation Convergence Initiative, is so close to my heart, because the more we can come from that, we're finding incredible partners and others that just are ready to say yes now. And whether that's in economics or education or justice or governance or whatever it may mean, and whatever level it may mean, it's a yes and get out of the way to it.
I think that Donald Trump may have saved us by crashing a system that we weren't going to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
Posting along and something wasn't really working, but we were really very dead, asleep. And now everybody's alive, and the world is just vibrating. And I'm just sometimes thinking, boy, wouldn't that be something if he was our savior? The best.
Well, yeah, and if you look at evolution, if you look at evolution over 4 billion years, it's run at 3 different levels where things are easy. It's really doesn't, everybody does exactly that, Suzanne. There's a complacency. Well, I rock the boat, even if it's a little uncomfortable. So if we look at the last 10,000 years with all of the journey we've been on, the environment has been very stable, really. And so from a biological perspective, evolution's been very, very slow. In longer term cycles, named after a Serbian researcher called Milankovic, differences in Earth's orbit and all the rest of it make environmental niches able to sort of drive evolution a bit faster. But it's when it's been, breakdown or unsustainability that the big changes have happened. And what I would suggest is that to now has been unsustainability driving biological evolution. And a lot of that comes from something called horizontal gene transfers, where the whole sentience of the biosphere and the gaiosphere just comes together in incredibly radical and rapid transformation. I'm suggesting now that instead of horizontal gene transfer, we're talking about horizontal meme transfer. We've got an internet, we've got a global communications opportunities, not just to share memes of breakdown, but memes of breakthrough and stories, and invite, this empowerment and this authentic hope to be our new narrative, which of itself is ancient, but it is this convergent unitive narrative, and stand on that to take ourselves forward. So Roger's Roger's one of our media maestros in our Evolutionary Leaders Media Collab. But this is it. It's horizontal meme transfer, I think, is what we're talking about now.
And you know, memes are elements of culture, so we're really talking about cultural evolution, which
Absolutely.
mainstream science is just dipping their toe into. But then beyond that, we have the evolution of consciousness as well. Can you say a little bit about that relationship of culture and consciousness and evolution?
I think they intertwine because, when we look at the work of Donella Meadows that Heidi knows so well, in terms of change, the greatest impact for change is a change in worldview, the lens through which we see the world. But that worldview is always then expressed as narrative. And the narrative is expressed through stories. And those are essentially the mycelium of our culture. And they get played out. Now, it seems to me that what we have, we have got structures, organizations, that are are based on a scientific worldview that itself is over 100 years out of date. So this isn't just about changing culture. This is a radical transformation of everything, but without culture, without a cultural acceptance and almost an embrace of the potential, the positivity for this. Those changes won't happen, but I'm seeing it all over I'm seeing it everywhere. But it is about narrative, it's about stories, it's about and what does that mean? Because if our worldview drives our behaviors, then I would say our behaviors drive our worldview. So we're in conversation, amongst others, with people like Indy Johar, who is doing these major transformational changes in bioregional areas around the world. He's not overtly trying to change people's worldview. He's trying to change their behavior into more communal, more multi-level communal partnerships. But what's happening is they're changing their views of each other. They're changing their worldviews. They're moving into more of a we space. And because they're working with the land and our planetary home, they're moving more into the all space. So it's this dance of behaviors and worldviews, narratives and culture. It's all part of the metamorphosis. And so it comes back, I think, to what's ours to do individually and communally within that metamorphosis. Because I'm not a politician. I'll be the worst politician in the world. But there are some amazing politicians and they're amazing leaders. In Iceland, we met Halla Tomasdottir, the new president, who wants to make Iceland a beacon of light in the world, whose corporate background means that she can link up and lift up across Nordic countries and beyond. And we're working with so many others that in their own sphere are leading the way into this unitive perspective. So, how do we help them? How do we help them to link up? How do we link up together? And how do we synergize our efforts and make our efforts more coherent and more impactful? And that is the call of culture, I would say.
Jude, I want to share kind of an experience and see how you reflect on it. Sometimes I feel like I kind of live in two worlds. We see this material world out there, and if you watch the news, which I pretty much don't, I follow it a little bit, but all this drama, all this stuff going on doesn't look good, looks pretty bad. And then I spend a lot of my work time with talking with people like you and Heidi and pretty much everyone on this call. It's a completely different world, it feels like to me. And I have this sense of a weaving together happening. It's the classic effect from evolution where you see in crisis what happens is things come together and form higher levels of complexity, something higher, more higher functioning. And so I very much see this happening. It's kind of invisible. And sometimes I try to talk to people that I know out there in that other world that are struggling. They're just hurting and saying, there's something going on, there's something happening, but I don't know quite how to really language that or prove it. Of course, people like proof. But how do you see that, and how would you describe what it is that's happening that's still invisible?
Yes, I mean, for me, I describe it as the evolutionary impulse of our universe flowing through us. Because our universe has an innate impulse to evolve from simplicity to complexity. We've seen that over 14 billion years. We've seen that in our planetary home over 4 billion years. You know, from sort of single-celled to without nuclei to more cooperation, because every time that journey from simplicity to complexity has occurred, many, numerous, it's actually involved cooperation rather than competition. It's actually taken things to the next level of complexity through through coherent cooperation. And I do see that happening now. But when I describe it, I do describe it as this impulse of our universe to evolve through us, to know itself through us. And so us awakening to remember who we really are and who we can consciously evolve to become, for me, is the invitation of the universe. And I think for young people, especially, that is an exciting invitation. That's an invitation to adventure. That's an invitation to know that they have meaning and purpose and that they belong. I mean, one of the beautiful things about the film, Radical Guide to Reality, was when we did focus groups with 13, 14-year-olds, they were saying before they saw the film that they weren't sure they had meaning or purpose. The constant that came from all of them after seeing the film was they know they do, and they know they belong. And that, for me, was the most beautiful response I could have ever hoped for. So the more we can help folks to know that, the unity is not uniformity and it's beyond diversity. It's that everyone, the universe is extraordinary in its unity expressed in its abundance. Every leaf on every tree is different. Every snowflake is different. And we're talking about one planetary home. Every one of us, 8 billion plus, is unique. And yet, we are truly inseparable from each other and the whole world. So that message, that invitation, which is the invitation of our entire universe, it seems to me, is worthwhile sharing and worthwhile hearing and worthwhile listening to and worthwhile saying yes to.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful. Well, we're past the hour, and we were shooting for kind of an hour, and I'd just like to see if anyone else has final thoughts, or Jude, and
I'll just say as kind of a newcomer to kind of this level of conversation. I've had it with Roger, but there's a whole synchronicity here. Thank you. Very inspiring. And I just feel very grateful to have sat in on this today and been inspired by it. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Joni, we've not heard from you.
I was still back in the beginning of your talk about the Fool's card in the tarot.
That's
and
the
the
one.
jumping. And, I have made that jump so many times. It's been my career. That was my career path, was jumping into that abyss every time. Like, oh my God, my neck is out. I have no idea what I'm jumping into. And part of it is that hero's journey, right? You get the call,
yes,
and you make the journey. You take the jump. And when you say link up and lift up, I think that's like hold hands and jump, because we don't know. It is a big unknown. And it's not fixing the old way. That's not a plan. And we don't know the new way yet. And so there is so much faith that comes in this. And I think your contextualizing of the universe story helps us say, well, okay, this is a stream I can have faith in, even though it's an unknown. But I do think the mystery of this and the knowing that nothing short of deep and rapid transformation is going to do it. There's really not any other option, because the way ahead is just not a way. It's not a way. We know that. So yeah, may we all jump. May we all be the fool, and may we all. And may we have. I love
that.
We get in there.
Yeah, you have to swim as well. I love that because, of course, the whole hero's journey was Joe Campbell, and Bob knows Joe Campbell's work very, very well. And I was having this conversation a few years ago, and going to that point of it's not just a me on this hero's journey; it's the we. And so I came up with it. We came up with it. We're on the weirdos journey.
Well, and the fool, I mean, that
I'm
has
happy to be so.
I know, but so many of us were weirdos. So many of us didn't go the corporate path. And so we were weirdos from the beginning until now. And, so that actually triggers me a little bit.
I'm sorry.
Maybe all be fools. Maybe not weird, but may we all be fools.
May we all be fools.
I mean,
absolutely.
That's really what that impetus of the deep and rapid transformation was about. Somebody said, yeah, all this fringy stuff isn't so fringy anymore. And I thought, we're not on the fringe of anything. We're at the center of something completely new and different. We don't know what it is, but it's really just taking that leap of faith, because that's what's ours to do in all the beautiful, diverse ways that we choose to leap and dance, into it.
Beautiful. Thank you. I love that we're all holding hands and just jumping together.
We are
into the fool's cauldron, right?
No, by all mainstream thinking, conventional wisdom, we are total fools. And this whole idea of an evolving universe, we're fools. So let's stick together.
And Roger, thank you so much for inviting us into.
Yes, it's been wonderful, Jude. Thanks all of you for coming. It's been just great.